about the 1980s for the last couple days. So we talked about the rise of conservatism. We talked about the Reagan Revolution. Ronald Reagan becomes president, and then we talked about the end of the Cold War yesterday. Today we kind of wrap it all up with a bow, and talking about the 1990s and the 2000s. Okay, so this is the lecture America in the 1990s and 2000s PowerPoint that's in your drive. So I would get that out, follow along for one last time. Okay, so we start with the 1990s. We actually have to go a little bit into the 1980s. I lied. 1988, George H.W. Bush becomes president. Okay, not George W. Bush. This is his dad, George H.W. Bush. Okay, he is a Republican, so he's kind of riding on this conservative wave that we've been talking about with Reagan. So Reagan was a Republican, people loved Reagan. Then we get George H.W. Bush. Okay, so he is also a Republican, pretty conservative, not as much as Reagan, but still very conservative. He becomes president again in 1988. Okay, his presidency is really kind of like summarized or focused largely around an event called the Gulf War. Okay, sometimes you might hear this referred to as the first Iraqi War, or the first war in Iraq. It's all the same thing. Okay, the Gulf War refers to a war that's fought in Iraq in the 1990s, though. Okay, so that's kind of a point of distinction. We do fight Iraq again. Actually, his son does, which we'll talk about in a second. I'm getting ahead of myself. In the 2000s, but in his presidency, we're fighting for the very first time against Iraq, and again we call it the Gulf War. So this war starts in 1990 when Iraq's dictator at the time, a man named Saddam Hussein, invades a nearby region called Kuwait. Okay, now Kuwait is a very tiny little country with massive amounts of wealth. Okay, very wealthy nation because they have some of the richest oil reserves in the world. Okay, so people are constantly fighting over Kuwait. It's just kind of like it's a world issue. Okay, and so Saddam Hussein, who by the way is a terrible person, like he has multiple human rights violations against him. He's known for killing off his own people, using chemical weapons. I mean, he's just a terrible person. In 1990, he invades Kuwait to try to take it over. Okay, now in order to prevent this, the United States invades Iraq, okay, because we want to prevent them from taking over Kuwait, okay. Now, this is what we call the Gulf War. It's not a long war, and the United States eventually comes out victorious. The probably most important or well-known battle that we fight is in 1991. It's something called Operation Desert Storm. You may have heard it, but this is kind of our last stand where we drive out Iraqi soldiers from Kuwait. 184 Americans die, so it's a pretty deadly battle, but it is what makes us successful against Iraq, and again, kind of frees Kuwait, leaves it free, prevents their takeover from Iraq. Okay. At the end of the war, we end up leaving some troops stationed over in the Middle East. So this increases our presence in the Middle East, which we still have a lot of troops stationed over there today. That really starts with the aftermath of the Gulf War. But kind of a longer lasting significance is what it means, because this is the first war that's been fought after the Cold War. Okay. So America, like we talked about yesterday, has kind of rose to the top and is now kind of the unchallenged, world superpower. And so any war that involves the United States is kind of a big deal, and it's kind of reshaping our identity in the world. So the fact that we drive out Iraq and preserve the integrity and freedom of Kuwait, it's really the United States declaring that we now, as the world superpower, are going to strive to protect democracy and freedom throughout the world. If we see democracy threatened, then we're going to take it upon ourselves to free those people. Now, this is very similar to what we thought was our identity or our mission in the Cold War, right? Remember, we wanted to, cast out, get rid of, or contain communism in order to preserve freedom. So that message hasn't changed, but it has broadened, right? Because now communism isn't the threat. Any threat to democracy, the United States is going to take issue with it. So if anything, it kind of broadens our involvement in world relations, and it puts more responsibility on the United States because, again, we are the only world superpower kind of left in the world at that point. Okay, so this war is important, even though it's short, because it reshapes our identity as kind of the keepers of freedom and democracy throughout the world. Okay, so by the time we get to the late, the beginning of the 90s, There is a slight economic downturn, so there's like a little bit of a recession, and so at that time, America decides, it's time for a change, and so we do not elect another Republican. We're followed by a Democratic president, and that is Bill Clinton. Okay, I'm sure you have heard many things about the Clinton administration. Has a long legacy for a lot of different reasons, which we're going to get into. And so you have a Democratic presidency, a Democratic administration in the Clinton era. Okay, so this is the early to late 90s. He serves 2 terms, very popular president among his base. Democrats, even to this day, love the Clintons. Okay, they may not love Hillary, but everybody just loves Bill. Okay, so anyways, he's a Democrat, and so he institutes some more socially liberal policies like we would expect a Democratic president to do. So for instance, he supports abortion rights. He's a fan of Roe v. Wade. He appoints more women and people of color to his administration into high-ranking government jobs. He expands health care coverage. He also enacts a kind of controversial policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. You may have heard of this before, but it was meant to basically protect people who were gay in the military, because up until this point, you could not be homosexual in the military. It wasn't allowed. They would kick you out of the military. Okay, so Clinton, in order to kind of protect these gay soldiers, he decides, don't ask, don't tell, don't reveal it, don't tell, and then we just won't ask. So kind of like keeping it under the table, and in that way kind of protecting these soldiers without having to get the military to actually change their policy. Okay, so he does a lot of more socially progressive policies throughout his administration. He also tries to kind of undo some of the Republican or conservative economic policies that we saw characterize the Reagan and Bush administrations. So he raises taxes on the rich. He brings in some more welfare programs, some more like anti-poverty programs. He does try to reform the welfare program actually pretty extensively. And he also starts a new free trade alliance called NATO. Or I'm sorry, not NATO, NAFTA. North Atlantic Free Trade Association, which actually really interesting. President Trump has taken a major issue with, and you may have heard in the last few months that he is basically attempting to get rid of NAFTA and introduce a new kind of fair trade policy in its place. Okay, so that's something that he has taken issue with, but that original free trade alliance, it started here in the Clinton administration. So kind of bringing history to life for you. Okay, now Clinton, he prefers to focus on domestic policy. He's not really concerned with what's going on in the world. Remember, this is coming off of the heels of the Gulf War. We just got out of a pretty significant war, and so by the time we get to the 90s, most Americans want to focus on, focus on us and forget about everybody overseas. We kind of go through periods of this in history. We kind of involve ourselves overseas, and then we just kind of look inward for a while. The 90s is very much that. And so rather than work on their own, Clinton, he works largely through the United Nations. He likes to work in big coalitions with other countries. So he just kind of is focusing more on domestic policies, what's going on in the United States and what's going on outside of the United States. Okay, but can't talk about Clinton without talking about it. What he's probably best known for, unfortunately, is his impeachment scandal and in trial. In 1998, okay, some allegations came out against Bill Clinton for sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. Okay, so one of his interns, Monica Lewinsky, she alleged that she had some sexual misconduct with the president. And then you had another woman named Paula Jones who sued the president essentially for sexual harassment. Okay, now when these allegations come out, they're really serious, and so people start asking Clinton, did you do these things? Did you behave this way? And he says no. Okay, over and over again, no, I didn't have sexual relations with these women. I don't know what they're talking about. Okay, and these aren't just people asking him. These are like official questions coming from Congress. Okay, you can't lie, and so it comes out that he did actually lie, and that he did have sexual relations and misconduct with these different women. And so because he lied, he is impeached. And this is where a lot of confusion comes. Clinton was not impeached because he had an affair. He was impeached because he lied about it. So the charges are perjury. Not necessarily, the act itself is that he lied about the act. Okay. And so, anyways, it's a Republican controlled Congress at the time, or controlled House. House of Representatives. And so remember, impeachment is a two-part process. You have your impeachment trial in the House of Representatives, and if they vote to impeach you, then it goes to the Senate, who then removes you. Okay, they vote to remove the president. So both chambers of Congress play a role in removing the president. It's not just one. Okay, and so you have this impeachment trial in the House. It goes on for a while. Republicans, though, they fail in the end to get enough votes to actually remove Clinton from office. So even though he is impeached, he is never actually removed, and he finishes out that second term. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Clinton administration in the 90s, kind of what's going on politically. Economically, though, the 90s is a really transformative time, because this is when you get the rise of the computer and the internet. Okay, think about for a second, what role television played in the United States. Like the 60s and the 70s would not have been the 60s and the 70s without television. I mean, think about watching, the moon landing, for instance. Think about watching the images in Vietnam, or, the televised Martin Luther King I Have a Dream speech, right? Those events would not have been what they were if people weren't watching them on TV. You have a similar transformative effect because of the internet and computer revolution of the 1990s and early 2000s. Okay, you have all these new companies, right? Apple, IBM, Dell, Microsoft, all these new companies that are mass hiring. Okay, so people are being employed in all of these new industries. That's also going to spur the economy. Okay, think about too about like online retail. Before, if you wanted a business, you had to like rent out a building and pay your rent. You don't have to do that on the internet. I mean, think about Etsy, for instance, right? Like if you're just like, knitting some socks on quarantine, you can throw them on Etsy and you can just sell them, right? You don't need to pay rent for that necessarily, like a brick and mortar store. So you have all of these new businesses that have an online venue. Okay, so it's a massive rise in terms of the economy. Okay, lots of economic growth comes as a result of the computer and the internet. By the time we get to the year 2000, so throughout the 90s, about half of Americans own a computer and have internet access in their homes. So it's a really, kind of fast and intense kind of rise in access to internet and the computer. Okay, and this like kind of really fast increase in access to the internet and to computers, it creates something called the stock market, or .com bubble. Okay, where again you have this massive rise in the economy because of the internet. But it kind of creates like this bubble effect because it comes up so quickly. So, for instance, between 1998 and 1999, in 1 year, the Nasdaq, which is the stock exchange for the internet, essentially, it rose more than 500%. Those stocks went up on the Nasdaq 500% in 1 year. Just astronomical economic growth reflected in the stock market. Okay, now we're going to see that what goes up quickly must come down, right? So we kind of have a replay of the 1920s into the Great Depression happening here with the dot-com bubble, but let's hang on to that for just a second, okay? The job market by 2000, because of all this new economic growth, is amazing. Unemployment is at 4%, which again, just to be reminded, like a healthy economy, great unemployment is anywhere between 4 and 6%. So in 2000, it was on the lower range of that great level, really low unemployment for the United States. Okay, wages, family income is growing significantly, especially in the tech field. This is where people like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, this is where they made their millions and their billions. It was in the 1990s when everybody for the first time is getting access to computers and the internet. Okay, and so all of a sudden you have like a couple of people that own 40-50% of what all Americans own. So you have, even though a rise in wages among these tech giants, you have massive wealth inequality between them and everybody else. Okay, which largely still remains today. They typically, if you're in tech, you typically are on those lists of like the wealthiest Americans. So that industry still kind of dominates those wealth brackets. So companies also start outsourcing more and more of their labor. We talked about this when we did the 1970s, how you have more companies moving overseas. Once you have the computer or the internet, this becomes even easier because you can communicate with your business overseas, over in Southeast Asia, over in Mexico, over wherever. You don't have to send postage. You can just send an email. Okay, so you have even more businesses moving overseas because they are easy to access and communicate using the internet. And this has a really, really tough um, impact on workers, right? Because now you have more global competition. All of a sudden, by the time we get to the year 2000, over half of the labor force is making less than $14 an hour because you have to compete with all these overseas workers who don't make as much as Americans. So it drives down the wages here, and it causes a lot of Americans to lose their jobs, especially in these cities that had a company or a factory that everybody worked at. All of a sudden, that company's overseas, and so those communities are hit really, really hard. Okay, now like I alluded to a second ago, this is all great. It's all roses in the 1990s until the year 2000, basically, where the dot-com bubble burst. Okay, essentially, it just went too high, and it just burst. It just can't keep up with its rise, and so what ends up getting exposed is that all these companies had made all these fraudulent transactions. You have all of these major millionaires and billionaires now who are going to Congress and getting indicted for fraud. Enron is probably the best example of a company. You may have heard of that name before. They were the Enron executives went to jail. They committed horrendous fraud during the 1990s because everything was rising. A lot of it got overlooked or just dismissed, and so all of that comes kind of to a screeching halt in the year 2000. And so 2000, 2001, we do go through kind of a recession. Okay, so the year 2000. Oh man, I actually remember this. I'm dating myself. 2000, this recession is also an election year. Okay, and so Americans are deciding between two men. You have Al Gore, who's the Democrat. He was also Bill Clinton's vice president, well liked. And then you have George W. Bush, who was George H.W. Bush's son. Okay, so he's the Republican on the ballot. Now, um, remember, in our country, the president is decided through electoral votes, the electoral college, right? You have to get a certain number of electoral votes in order to win. Okay, now this doesn't happen very often, but every once in a while, the popular vote, like when they just straight count the ballots, how many did this guy get? How many did this guy get? It doesn't always match with the electoral count among the states. Okay, remember the electoral count is what we go with, and usually the two match, popular and electoral. Usually they match, but every once in a while they don't. 2000 was one of the years that they didn't. Okay, and it's a very close margin. I'm actually going to read it off my slide because I just always forget. Gore won the popular vote by 540,000 votes nationwide. That is like half of 1% of the entire total. Okay, so because it's so close, every single vote counts, and so it all comes down basically to Florida. Okay, why it always comes to Florida, I don't know. It always comes to Florida. Anyways, so we're looking at Florida in the year 2000, and Florida is going to determine who wins. Basically, it's the last state, and Bush is leading by just a couple hundred votes. Like that's it. It's even so close in Florida. It's too close to count. They have to count every single vote before they will even make a guess, a projection of who's going to win the election. Okay, now it comes out that Bush is the winner of Florida, but because it's so close, people start kind of questioning. Sorry, allergies. Okay, they start questioning. All right, now we used to do something really weird during before we did like electronic ballots and all that stuff. We used to vote by something called, so you get your ballot essentially. I wish I had something to do this with. You get your ballot, and you would have all these like perforated holes. Okay, hold on, Anthony. Can you get me a piece of paper and a pencil? Okay, I'll show you. Okay, so you would have all of these. You'd have like your ballot, and it would have everybody's name, and then it would have a bunch of like holes kind of next to it, and you'd have to punch out here. That's fine. That'll work. I don't know. It's fine.
with this.
Okay, so what it basically was, it's the year 2000 election today. So this is your ballot, let's say, okay? You'd read off the name, like here's Bush, here's Gore, okay? Bush and Gore. Let's say I wanted to vote for Bush, okay? Now I would punch my little thing through this, okay? And then it would say, okay, that would indicate I'm voting for Bush. Now, look on the back. You see this stuff hanging when you do that? Okay. A lot of people thought, well, if there was a small indentation in, close to another name that wasn't maybe all the way punched through, maybe the voter intended to vote for the other person and just kind of messed up. Okay, so there's all these questions swirling because of this method. So much so that these irregularities, we call this like flapping part on the end, on the other side, a hanging chat. And if you look at your PowerPoint, you'll see people, this is a really famous image, voting officials examining with magnifying glasses like the chat on the back and whether or not we can really count it. Is it punched through all the way? Who did they vote for? And so anyways, it just becomes this mess, this absolute mess. Now they keep recounting them because it's so close, and all of these different questions. They order a few times that they're going to recount the ballots. Now, what's the problem though? If you recount and keep touching paper ballots, right? All of a sudden, you might be making indentations that the voter didn't make, and so even more questions come. The more you touch them, can we trust them? Okay, so eventually, December 2000, the U.S. Supreme Court says, I'm deciding it, okay? Bush versus Gore Supreme Court case, it stops all the recounts and it allows the state's governor, Florida's governor, to call the election, okay? Now remember, the official winner right now is still George W. Bush. Those recounts are just seeing whether or not that can be overturned. So George W. Bush is still the winner of Florida as of this time. The Supreme Court decides the Florida governor, we're giving him the power to decide how this is going to play out. Okay, guess who the Florida governor is at the time? You just can't make this stuff up. It is Jeb Bush, which is George W.'s brother. Okay, so the brother essentially is going to decide the election for whether or not his brother wins. Okay, now to Jeb's credit, his brother had already technically won the state. In order to allow Gore to win the state, he would have to overturn the previous vote count. Okay, so he decides not to do that. He says basically the vote will stand. The count, as we have counted them thus far, the official winner is where it's just going to remain George W. Bush, my brother. Okay, now this really starts George W. Bush's presidency off on a bad foot, right? All Democrats basically think that this is fraud, corruption. They don't see George W. Bush as a legitimate president from the get-go, so it kind of delegitimizes him. But that's pretty short-lived, okay? Because in October 11th, 2001, just a few short months after his inauguration, people stop thinking about the 2000 election and they start thinking about 9/11, okay? So George W. Bush's presidency becomes less about the election and now more characterized by 9/11, which it still remains largely today. Okay, so we all know, we talked about this during the school year on 9/11, that Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda, his terrorist group, they basically launched an attack in New York City on the World Trade Towers using airplanes. George W. Bush acts very decisively. Okay, he basically says America is the beacon of freedom, and we are going to protect that. We call this the Bush Doctrine, where he basically starts with this doctrine, what we call a war on terror. Okay, so if you are a country, an organization, a party, if you support terrorism, the United States sees you as an enemy. That's basically what the Bush Doctrine says. Okay, and it, again, starts a war on terror, which is important because it's not a war against one country or one group like normal wars are. It's really a global war. If you support terrorism, the United States is against you. Okay, so it's a different type of war. Okay, and because of that, it has a lot of different components. October 2001, the United States attacks Afghanistan, which is where Osama bin Laden planned his attacks, trained, that's where he was headquartered. And so we attack Afghanistan to drive out the rest of that terrorist organization. Okay. After that, March 2003, he turns his sights to Iraq. Okay, Iraq still, the leader is Saddam Hussein. First Gulf War, which was his father, George H.W. Bush, that guy's still around. So George W. Bush believes that Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons in his possession, which he's not supposed to have. He also believes that Saddam Hussein is training or harboring terrorists. Okay, and so there are all of these UN inspections, and there's all of these investigations about whether or not this is true. George W. Bush believes that there is enough evidence, and so he launches an attack on Iraq, starting the second Iraq War in March of 2003. In 2006, Saddam Hussein is executed for war crimes. Remember, this is a terrible human being. Nobody is on Saddam Hussein's side. Whether or not, whatever you believe about the Iraq War, whether we should have been there or not, everybody agrees that Saddam Hussein is a terrible person and that Iraq is better off without him. Okay, kind of another thing that characterizes the Bush administration is something called the U.S. Patriot Act. Remember, we're fighting terrorism. It's a war on terror overseas and in the United States. So we're looking for terrorism within the U.S. as well. And the U.S. Patriot Act actually allows the federal government, the FBI, the CIA, to wiretap, to read emails, to spy on citizens, to look to see what they get out at the, what they rent at the library, to open mail, if they suspect terrorism. Okay, now at the time, everybody's kind of going along with it because the legacy of 9/11 and the fear of terrorism is driving people to approve of these things. But now, especially now, but also after, a few years after this law is passed, people start questioning it and asking, is this a violation of people's rights? Is this a violation of their privacy? Should we be reading emails and spying on citizens, all in the name of terror? And still kind of a question that lingers today, since it honestly was not that long ago. Okay. The 2000s economy, remember, you have this nationwide recession through 2000 to 2003. They are cutting manufacturing. Again, more and more companies are moving overseas. George W. Bush attempts to fix it by dropping interest rates and cutting taxes, right? He's Republican, and that's the way Republicans like to deal with those types of things. So he cuts taxes and he cuts interest rates, okay? Now, when he cuts interest rates, what we see happening is that Americans are encouraged to start buying homes, right? Low interest rates, low mortgage rates. People want to buy homes and take advantage of those, okay? So this starts a rise in home construction because now you have all these people that want to buy homes, just like in the 1950s, and so construction companies start building more homes. Now, here's the problem, is that the loans that people are taking out to get these mortgages, to buy these homes, are terrible loans, okay? It used to be in the 2000s, there was something called an interest-only loan, where you could buy like $1 million home, for instance, but you might only pay just the interest on it. So even though you own $1 million home, you're only paying a couple $100s a month because you're only paying the interest, not the full principal, not paying down the loan. Now, eventually, on a lot of these interest-only loans, it was only for a set amount of years. So you only pay interest for like 5 years. And then after that 5 years was up, guess what? Your $200 mortgage goes up to $3,000 a month. But nobody's thinking about that in the early 2000s. All they know is I can get this really cheap loan and I can get this really great house. Okay. The other thing that's happening with this is that you don't really have to provide any support for your loan doc. So you can just basically go to your loan officer and say, I work. And they go, oh, great. And you don't have to provide really any documentation for any of those claims. And so what ends up happening is that not only do people have terrible loans, but you have people who don't make that much money owning these really expensive homes. Okay. Now, eventually, this is going to culminate into what we all know as the housing crisis of 2007 and 2008, where all of a sudden, all of these bad loans that have been made throughout the years, they kind of have the day of reckoning. Everybody's loans skyrocket. Nobody can pay it. And so all of these homes go into foreclosure. Banks start losing tons of money. Again, just thousands of homes are being foreclosed on every single day during 2000 and 2007. And so that leads to what we call the Great Recession of 2008. You have kind of a mini stock market crash. Many of you may remember this period. Maybe some of your parents lost a home or were in danger of losing their home. This was something that affected Americans all across the country very, very recently, and we just now kind of recovered from. But all of this kind of is on the heels of a new election. And so 2008, Barack Obama wins the presidency. Okay, so George W. Bush, he served his 2 terms. He's followed up by Barack Obama. Now, Barack Obama does a lot of different things. For the economy, right? He's inheriting this huge crisis, a Great Recession, a housing crash, and so he pushes through a stimulus package. He increases unemployment benefits. He bails out the banks to keep them from closing. He freezes tax cuts. I mean, he just does all of these different things to try to revitalize a damaged economy. Okay. Something else he's really known for is the Affordable Care Act in 2010. We kind of call this colloquially Obamacare, but it's healthcare reform, trying to provide healthcare to all Americans and stop predatory insurance practices, trying to get insurance companies to treat people more fairly. So he's definitely known for that. We know that's been pretty controversial in the last couple of years. He also inherits the war on terror. It's actually during the Obama administration that we find Osama bin Laden and announce that he's dead. You have special forces that go in Pakistan actually in 2011. They find Osama bin Laden and they kill him. So Obama also continues Bush's war on terror during his presidency. You also have a lot of social activism as well. It's during the Obama administration that you get support for gay marriage. You have a lot of climate change legislation, gun control legislation. So he is known as a more progressive president. And so he pushes through a lot of socially progressive policies during the or during the mid to late 2000s. Let's see. He's also the first African American president, which is amazing. And so there's a lot to be said about Barack Obama and the things he does during his presidency. So, with that, that was your last U.S. history lecture of the year. You guys have completed a full year of U.S. history. Congratulations. This is it. You're done. I hope that you are as proud of yourselves as I am of you, that you started the year off strong, but finished the year strong despite everything that's happened. And I'm really glad that we had a chance, even over YouTube, to finish off the book and to kind of bring the whole story to a close. I hope that you, after this year, have a stronger appreciation for our nation's history. Even though we've had a lot of ups and a lot of downs in our nation's history, a lot of really, things to celebrate and things that, are very shameful that we've talked about. Our country's made a lot of mistakes. I hope that you leave this year, this last lecture, despite the ups and downs and mistakes and causes of celebration, just having a deeper appreciation for being an American and the history that's got us to this point. So, anyways, I love you guys. I'm glad that we took this ride together. Go wash your hands, finish off this year strong, a couple more weeks, but have a good